Before we start, I want you to sit with something. There's a species in this galaxy that other civilizations used to tell stories about. Not the way you tell stories about gods or monsters. The way you tell stories about things that shouldn't exist. Things that break the rules of how life is supposed to work. They were called different names by different species. The Saurelian Strategic Archives listed them as Homo sapiens, class designation, contested. Origin world, a mid-range rocky planet with the kind of gravitational pull that should have produced squat, dense organisms more focused on not dying than on anything else. The kind of world where the atmosphere itself is technically flammable. Where the oceans are full of things that eat each other. Where the weather kills. The archives noted that no confirmed contact had been made in 40 standard cycles. There were theories that they destroyed themselves. Their planet showed evidence of near-extinction events at least 3 times in recorded history. That they were a myth, a composite legend assembled from fragment transmissions and unreliable first contact accounts. That someone was fabricating reports to inflate threat assessments and justify military budget allocations. I was one of the analysts who signed off on the likely myth assessment. I wrote it myself. My name is Veth Karras, and I would like it noted for the record, in whatever record survives this, that I was, in the most comprehensive and professionally embarrassing way possible, wrong. This is my mission log. I annotate everything. It's a habit my supervisors find irritating and I find necessary, because if I don't write it down I will spend the rest of my life wondering if I imagined it. I did not imagine any of this. What follows is a first-hand account of the Vedran Station engagement, specifically, 41 hours aboard a disabled coalition cruiser with a human combat engineer, a Saurelian fleet in tactical retreat, and an enemy that had never lost a siege in 300 cycles. The enemy lost the siege. I am still not entirely sure how. Start the log. The first thing Veth Karras registered when the Valdres took its second hit was not the structural collapse of the portside tactical bay. Not the decompression alarm cycling through its 4-tone shriek. Not even the fact that Commander Oroshin was shouting his name from somewhere behind a wall of emergency smoke. It was the smell. Saurelians navigate by magnetic current and pressure change. This is known, this is documented, this is the first thing the coalition orientation packet explains when a non-Saurelian officer is assigned to a joint deployment. What the orientation packet does not explain, because no one ever thought it needed explaining, is that a Saurelian's olfactory system is almost entirely vestigial. Decoration. A biological footnote from an evolutionary period so distant it barely registers. The smell that hit Veth Karras, then, should not have registered at all. It smelled like something burning that was not the ship. Organic. Not circuitry. Not fuel cell rupture. Something with protein in it, something that had once moved under its own power, and the part of Veth's brain that handled taxonomic threat assessment, the part he had spent 14 years training into reflexive efficiency, took one involuntary scan of the data and, then, did something it had never done before. It stopped. Not paused. Stopped. Like a calculation that had encountered a value it didn't have a symbol for. Karras. Orev's voice, tight and ugly. Port nacelle is gone. We have hull fractures on decks 3 through 6 and I have no tactical officers left conscious. I need you at the main console. Now. Veth was already moving. His gill slits, 3 vertical lines running from jaw to collarbone, normally a flat gray-green, had flushed a deep, unpleasant amber. He noted this in the way that he noted everything, filed it, labeled it stress indicator, severity, elevated, moved on. The Valdres was a Saurelian midline cruiser, which meant it was built for precision deployment and data relay rather than direct engagement, which meant it was categorically not supposed to be in the middle of a Krethnali siege formation, which meant that whoever had approved this patrol route was going to have a very difficult performance review assuming anyone on the Valdres survived to file one. Veth was beginning to suspect the survival odds were not in anyone's favor. The Krethnali did not lose sieges. This was not propaganda. This was not exaggeration. 312 cycles of documented military history, 47 distinct conflicts across 6 different coalition members, and the Krethnali siege formation had never, not once, failed to break a fortified position within one standard rotation. They were methodical. They were patient. They surrounded, they cut supply lines, they applied pressure in measured increments until the structural and morale integrity of the target position collapsed simultaneously, like a compound fracture healing roan. The Valdres had stumbled into the outer edge of their formation around Vethran Station 14 hours ago. The station had been under siege for 6. Veth reached the main console. Half the displays were dark. 3 of the 5 tactical officers who should have been seated at the surrounding stations were either evacuated or, the amber in his gill slits deepened, not evacuated. He pulled up the status readout and spent approximately 4 seconds absorbing information that, cumulatively, was among the worst he had received in his career. Drive capability, 17%. Enough for emergency drift. Not enough for a jump calculation. Hull integrity, 61% and dropping. The fractures on decks 3 through 6 were venting to space in 2 places. Emergency bulkheads had sealed, but the sealed sections contained, he checked, life support controls for the aft crew quarters, the secondary armory, and the emergency medical bay. Crew status, 43% nominal. Of the remaining 57%, 12 confirmed casualties, the rest injured, sheltering, or unresponsive. Coalition reinforcements, 11 hours out, at minimum. The nearest support vessel had received the Valdres's distress beacon 20 minutes ago and responded with a message Veth had read 3 times because the language was so formally apologetic that he'd initially assumed it was a condolence notice rather than a tactical assessment. It was, functionally, both. "We are," Veth said, to no one in particular, entering the data into his mission log with the flat mechanical efficiency he applied to all high-stress documentation, in an extremely poor tactical position. "Yes," said Orav, who had appeared at his shoulder. "I had noticed." There was a pause. Somewhere in the ship, something that should not be making sound was making sound, a deep, irregular percussion, like something striking metal from the inside. Not the hull. Lower. More purposeful. Veth noted it. Tagged it as unknown anomaly, structural, priority, secondary. He had 14 more urgent things to address first. He never got to the 14 more urgent things. Because the secondary armory, the one sealed behind emergency bulkheads, the one currently venting atmosphere in a slow and, technically fatal way, its internal camera feed, which Veth had pulled up mostly to assess whether the stored ordnance was at risk, showed him something that brought his entire threat assessment process to the same grinding halt it had managed earlier. There was someone in the armory. Someone who should not have been in the armory, because the armory was sealed and, venting and, accessible only by the maintenance conduit that ran through the belly of the ship like a spine, a conduit that was, he checked, because he checked everything, 43 centimeters in diameter. Maintenance conduits on Sorelian vessels were sized for automated repair drones, not for anything with a skeleton. The camera was showing him something with a skeleton. Bipedal. 2 arms, 2 legs, proportions wrong in a way he couldn't immediately process, the limbs were too long for the torso, or the torso was too long for the limbs, or both, or neither, he couldn't tell. His spatial calibration was clearly compromised by the stress indicators flooding his system. The figure was wearing something darkened, segmented, a suit of some kind, patched in at least 4 places with materials that didn't match the original. A helmet with a single horizontal visor. No species markings Veth recognized. The figure was not panicking about the atmospheric venting. The figure appeared to be, he zoomed the feed, sorting through the weapons canisters. Not frantically. With the deliberate, slightly impatient efficiency of someone who has been asked to find something in a poorly organized closet and is deeply annoyed by the organizational system. Orav, Veth said, in the voice he used when he was very certain of a fact and very uncertain of its implications, "We have an intruder in the secondary armory." Orav looked at the feed. His own gill slits, slate blue at rest, they'd gone nearly white, didn't change. They'd been white since the second hit. There was nothing left in them to escalate. "How," said Orav, "did anything get into a sealed, venting compartment through a 43-centimeter conduit?" Veth had no answer for this. He added it to the log. He labeled it priority, high, classification, unknown, recommended action, observe. The figure in the armory found what it was looking for. Veth watched it. He kept his documentation deliberately impersonal while his threat assessment model was still in its uncharacteristic freeze state. Extract a plasma cutter from the third canister, 2 canisters of emergency sealant foam, and a handheld structural analyzer. It conducted a brief and, apparently satisfactory inventory, secured the items to what Veth could now see was a heavily loaded equipment harness, and then moved to the armory's internal wall panel. It pulled off the panel cover. The atmospheric venting, the slow bleed that had been depressurizing the sealed sections, stopped. Veth checked the readout. The leak rate had dropped to 0. Not sealed, exactly. The structural integrity was still compromised. But the pressure differential had been equalized, which meant the vent had been plugged, somehow, from inside the conduit, before the figure entered the armory, which meant the figure had addressed the atmospheric breach on its way through the maintenance conduit while the conduit was still active. While moving through a space that a maintenance drone would have navigated with difficulty, he stopped trying to reconstruct the sequence. He watched the figure replace the panel cover, secure it with 3 precise strikes from a tool Veth didn't recognize and couldn't classify, and then cross the armory to the emergency bulkhead, the sealed door that had been locked by the ship's automated damage control system, the lock that required command-level authorization to override. The figure took out a small device, pressed it against the bulkhead's lock housing, and the door opened. Veth noted this. He noted this very carefully. Unknown entity has bypassed command-level security lock using unidentified device. Approximate transit time through aft maintenance conduit, 12 minutes. Atmospheric breach sealed in transit. Equipment secured. Lock bypassed. Estimated time of entry to active ship sections, imminent. The figure walked through the bulkhead door. And stopped. Because on the other side of the bulkhead door, waiting with 3 of the Vulgrus's security personnel Veth had sent them the moment he saw the armory feed, he wasn't entirely incompetent, was a tense, unhappy reception committee. The security team had their weapons raised. The figure looked at them. Then, it raised both hands, slowly, with the particular quality of gesture that Veth had learned to read across 17 different species. As I am aware this looks bad. Hey, the figure said. Your ship is broken. I'm here to fix it. The voice came through the hull pickup, slightly distorted, translated by the ship's linguistic matrix in real time, which meant the translation was technically accurate but possibly missing nuance. Veth queued up the audio buffer and ran it through the secondary translation filter. Same result. Both filters agreed on the meaning. Your ship is broken. I'm here to fix it. Said with, and this was the part both filters noted as contextually anomalous, a quality of casual competence that the linguistic matrix kept flagging as inappropriate to context. Not dismissive. Not arrogant. The tone of someone who has assessed a problem, determined that the problem is solvable, and is mildly impatient to begin solving it. The way Veth might describe a calculation error. Not a crisis. An error. The security team did not lower their weapons. The figure did not appear troubled by this. I can wait, it said. I mean, we're losing hull integrity at about a centimeter of fracture propagation every 4 minutes, so I'd rather not, but I can see you have concerns. Orav went to meet it. Veth wanted to note, for the log and also for his own future reference, that he was the one who suggested caution. He was the one who outlined the 17 reasons to keep the entity under security hold until the situation could be more fully assessed. He was the one who flagged that they had an unidentified species aboard, with unknown capabilities and undocumented access methods, in an already compromised tactical environment. Orav said, it fixed the atmospheric bleed, and went to meet it. This was, Veth suspected, either the best decision or the worst decision Orav would make in this crisis. He added it to the log under Command Decisions, Assessment, Pending. He watched the feed from the corridor outside the bulkhead. The figure had removed its helmet by the time Orav arrived. Veth got his first look at the face. Bilateral symmetry. 2 eyes, forward-facing. This detail would later appear in the preliminary contact reports and would require about 6 cycles of diplomatic correspondence to explain why Sorelian analysts had initially read forward-facing eyes as a predator indicator and flagged it as a threat classification before someone with more xenobiology background pointed out that this metric was, to use the technical term, Garbage: a flat nose, a wide jaw, brown skin with a texture that indicated environmental exposure, prolonged, type, radiation and impact, hair cropped close to the skull, a scar running from the left eyebrow to the hairline that had clearly not been treated by anything more sophisticated than the entity's own biology. The scar had healed well. This was the detail Veth found himself cataloging with disproportionate focus while the broader tactical picture continued to deteriorate around him. The scar tissue was dense and elevated, and the underlying structure was completely solid, which meant the wound had healed with the bone surface still intact, which meant the bone had been intact after what appeared to be, based on the width of the scar and the implied force, a significant impact injury. Veth did not have the xenobiology background to explain why this troubled him more than the bypassed security lock. "I'm Sergeant Adeyemi," the figure said to Orav. "Coalition liaison attachment. I was on the station when the siege started. Got out on a runner 6 hours ago, been trying to reach any intact coalition vessel since. Your distress beacon was the only one still transmitting." "How did you reach us?" Orav said, which was not the question Veth would have led with but was a reasonable starting point. "Runner's gone," she said, without inflection. "Caught a hull breach on the approach. I EVA'd the last 3 kilometers. A pause. Orav's gill slits had shifted from white to a pale, uncertain gray. "You traversed 3 kilometers of open vacuum," he said. "Yeah." She was already pulling the structural analyzer from her harness, already beginning to look at the corridor walls in a way that suggested she was thinking about something other than this conversation. "Your hull fractures are worse than your sensors are reading. The internal integrity monitors on decks 4 and 5 are probably giving you bad data because the sensors themselves are in the fracture zone." "You want me to show you?" "You EVA'd 3 kilometers, Orav said again. She looked at him. A brief, evaluating look, the way Veth looked at data that wasn't matching his model. "Do you want me to fix your ship or not?" She had been in the field for, she mentioned at one point while running a fracture analysis on the Deck 4 bulkhead, 11 hours. Before the 6-hour EVA transit and the maintenance conduit transit and the armory inventory, before Veth had ever seen her face on a camera feed. 11 hours of active combat in a besieged station, and she moved through the Valdris's damaged corridors like someone with a task list and an acceptable timeframe, pausing at junctions to consult the structural analyzer, occasionally pressing her palm flat against a wall in a way that she didn't explain and Veth didn't ask about. He was too busy adding things to the log. He followed her at a distance that he told himself was professionally appropriate and that his gill slits, now cycling between amber and a deeper, more complex color he didn't have a clinical name for, were suggesting was something else. He told himself he was documenting. He was documenting. But he was also watching the way she moved, with that quality of forward-facing, purposeful efficiency, the way she spoke to the 2 surviving crew members she encountered in the Deck 4 corridor, brief, direct, not unkind, something in her body language that caused both of them to look slightly less like they were in the process of having a cardiovascular event. "What's your hull material rated for?" she asked him, at one point. Not looking at him. Studying the junction between 2 hull sections where a fracture line was visible to the naked eye, a thin dark streak that was not thin or dark to Veth's magnetic perception, which was showing him a web of structural compromise spreading outward in 3 directions like a cracked mineral formation. "Standard Sorelian composite," he said. "Load-bearing capacity doesn't matter." She was already applying the emergency sealant foam to the crack, working from both ends toward the center in a precise, converging pattern. "I meant, is it porous? Some composite alloys wick the sealant wrong." Veth checked. "It has a microporous surface layer. The architect's specification is good. It'll bond better." She pressed the foam flat with the back of the plasma cutter, applying pressure with a consistency that suggested she had calibrated the force precisely, and Veth's magnetic perception watched the stress web in the hull narrow, the fracture lines compressing as the sealant engaged. Not fixed. Stabilized. She moved to the next fracture point. "You were on the station when the siege started," Veth said, because he was documenting and also because he needed to understand the sequence, and understanding the sequence required asking. 6 hours ago, yeah. The station has been under siege for 6 hours. She looked at him then. A brief evaluation, the same kind she'd given Orav. And you were present for the entire siege. Part of it. She was already at the next fracture. I was in the outer ring when the cordon went up. Took about 2 hours to get to the runner bay. Veth processed this. The outer ring of Vethran Station during the opening phase of a Crethnali siege was, he pulled the station schematics, he had pulled them the moment the Valdris entered the engagement zone, the first target zone. The Crethnali opened every siege with a systematic neutralization of the outer ring's defensive positions, 6 to 8 hours of sustained fire, before transitioning to the tightening cordon phase. The casualty projections for personnel in the outer ring during that phase were, he noted a specific section of hull plating near the corridor junction instead of completing the projection. The plating had a manufacturing stamp he didn't recognize. He catalogued it under materials, non-standard, origin, unknown. He was going to look it up later. He was not going to complete the casualty projection. What happened, he said, in the outer ring? She sealed the third fracture before answering. A lot, she said. The Crethnali made their next move 4 hours into Sergeant Adeyemi's systematic repair of the Valdris. It was not a move Veth had been expecting, which was itself a data point, because Veth had spent 14 years analyzing Crethnali tactical patterns and could, under normal circumstances, predict their operational sequencing to within a margin of half a standard rotation. They were methodical. They were known. This was the only comfort he had been holding on to since the Valdris had drifted into their formation, that even in a catastrophically compromised tactical position, the enemy's behavior was predictable, and predictability was a form of armor. They sent a communication. Not to the Valdris, to the station. But they broadcast it on coalition-accessible frequencies, which meant the Valdris's comms system caught it, which meant Veth heard it. The Crethnali Siege Commander, designation, Tactical Overlord Venras, a name Veth recognized from the Sorelian Strategic Archives, a name associated with a record that was, in the technical language of those archives, unblemished, transmitted a formal surrender demand to Vethran Station. Standard form. Standard terms. Veth had read 100 of them. The station's response came 11 seconds later. It was, in its entirety, "You're welcome to try." Veth stared at the communication log. He looked up from the communication log to where Adeyemi was working on the Deck 5 junction, 2 corridors away, methodically addressing what she had described as the main structural problem with the kind of focused disregard for everything else happening in the universe that Veth was beginning to identify as a consistent behavioral pattern. He went to the log. He opened a new entry. Notation: Station Vethran has responded to formal Crethnali surrender demand with a communication that translates as a challenge. Coalition forces on the station are aware of their tactical position. They are responding to it as if it is a. He paused, reviewing his translation options, preference, rather than a constraint. He sat with that for a moment. There is a word in Sorelian isevrath for the behavior of an entity that continues a course of action after rational assessment has determined the action is non-viable. It is not a complementary word. It is used to describe systems failure, not choice. I am beginning to think sevrath is not the right word for what I am looking at. I do not yet have the right word. End notation. Adeyemi had stopped working. She was looking at the communication display on the nearest wall panel. She had apparently been listening. "That's Reeves," she said. Veth looked at her. "You recognize the communication?" "I recognize the phrasing." A pause. She went back to work. "Station still holding, then, dot." "The station is still holding," Veth confirmed. "Against a full Crethnali siege formation." "Yeah." The plasma cutter hissed. "They'll be fine." Veth noted the confidence. He noted it with a precision that was, and he was aware of this, slightly disproportionate to its tactical relevance. He noted the flatness of her tone, the absence of anything that his biological stress monitors would register as hope, because hope had a physiological signature. Hope involved elevated arousal states, hope required uncertainty, and Adeyemi's voice when she said "they'll be fine" had none of that. It sounded like a forecast. Like someone reading atmospheric data and stating, with the boredom of professional accuracy, that it was going to rain. The ship's drive managed 22% by the end of the 4th hour. Not enough for a jump. Enough for maneuvering. Enough, in Veth's tactical assessment, to make the Valdres a marginally less stationary target. He said this to Adeyemi, who was finishing the last of the primary fracture repairs and running a secondary scan with a focus that he had stopped interrupting, because he had noticed that interrupting her focus produced a very brief but very legible expression that the linguistic matrix translated as "I was doing something important and now I am doing something important," while also being polite about being interrupted. 22% drive, he said. Hull integrity currently at 74%, up from 61%. We can maneuver. Good. She secured the scanner. You should move to grid position 7 Alpha. Veth checked the tactical map. Grid position 7 Alpha was, he ran the numbers, a specific point in the engagement zone that, from a standard tactical standpoint, offered no particular defensive advantage. It was not sheltered by any debris field. It was not outside the Krethnali sensor range. It was not closer to the coalition reinforcement vector. What it was, he realized, working through the geometry, was a specific angle relative to the station, an angle that placed the Valdres in the exact position to observe the northern approach corridor of the siege formation without being the primary target of any of the cordon vessels. Why, he said. Because that's where you're going to want to be in about 3 hours, she said. She did not explain what was going to happen in 3 hours. He moved the Valdres to grid position 7 Alpha. He was going to ask her to explain. He was framing the question, organizing it, deciding how to pose it in a way that conveyed professional necessity rather than the other thing, the thing his gill slits were indicating with their continued refusal to return to their resting gray-green. He never asked. Because from grid position 7 Alpha, at that specific angle, through the one functional long-range sensor array the Valdres still had operational, Veth could see the northern approach corridor of the siege formation. And, the northern approach corridor of the siege formation was, without any communication or forewarning or tactical signal that his sensors could detect, beginning to fall apart. Not under fire. Not from any external force. From inside. The Krethnali cordon vessels on the northern arc were breaking formation, not retreating, not repositioning, breaking, the tight geometry of their siege formation developing gaps where no gaps should exist, the coordinated firing patterns that had been cycling with metronomic regularity for the last 6 hours developing stutters and dead spaces and, in one case, a vessel that had simply stopped moving altogether. Veth's threat assessment model, which had been performing adequately again since recovering from its earlier freeze, looked at this data and produced its analysis. The analysis read, unknown. He looked at Adeyemi. She was standing by the viewport, looking at the tactical display, and she had the expression of someone who had run the calculation earlier and was now watching the result confirm itself. Not satisfied, exactly. More the specific, contained quality of someone whose forecast had been accurate, as expected, because it was always accurate, and accuracy was not a surprise. Who was on that station? Veth said. She glanced at him. I told you, she said. Coalition liaison attachment. How many? She looked back at the display. The northern arc was continuing to fragment, the orderly siege geometry unraveling at a rate that Veth's models were having difficulty processing because the models did not have a framework for this, for a Krethnali formation that had never lost a siege beginning to show, in its third most fortified approach corridor, what could only be described as fear. 12, she said. Give or take. 12. 12 personnel. Veth did not look at the tactical display. He looked at the scuff on the toe of her left boot, a mark that had caught his peripheral magnetic perception earlier and that he had been cataloging in an absent, automatic way. The scuff was not from the EVA transit. It was older than that, worn into the material by repeated contact with a specific surface. He had noted, earlier, that the contact pattern suggested she spent a significant amount of time in crouched positions on rough ground. He noted this again now. He noted it very carefully, and did not look at the display, and did not look at the 12 contacts in the station that were apparently doing something to a 300-cycle undefeated siege formation that the word Sevrath did not cover. Veth Karras had a habit, professionally inconvenient and personally impossible to break, of annotating things that were not strictly relevant to the mission log. Environmental observations. Conversational asides. The precise color temperature of the emergency lighting on Deck 5, which was running at 83% and producing a faint red-orange cast that made everyone look, to his magnetic perception, like they were slowly being compressed. The way the Valdres's recycled air smelled in different sections of the ship, metallic near the damaged nacelle, flatter and drier near the sealed crew quarters, and, in the section of corridor where Adeyemi had been working for the last 4 hours, something else. Something warm. Like a biological process operating at elevated output. Like an engine that had been running hard for a long time and had not been told to stop. He annotated all of it. He told himself this was documentation. It was, in part, documentation. But, the other part, the part that had taken over an increasing percentage of his processing capacity since the northern arc of the Krethnali Formation had begun its inexplicable structural collapse, was something his professional framework was not adequately equipped to name, and his personal framework was declining to name because naming it felt like a concession, and Veth was not in the habit of conceding things until the data made it unavoidable. The data was making more and more things unavoidable. He was in the comms bay when the second message came from the station. This one was not a broadcast. It was a direct, encrypted coalition frequency transmission addressed specifically to the Valdres, which meant that whoever was transmitting knew exactly where they were, which meant they were watching the engagement zone, which meant he pulled the sender designation. It was originating from inside Vethran Station's operational core, which the Krethnali had been shelling for approximately 3 hours. The transmission was audio only. No visual. Background noise was significant, something structural and repetitive, something that sounded like percussive impacts on a large surface, something that his military acoustics training identified as weapons fire, medium to heavy caliber, distance, close, direction, multiple. A voice cut through it. Valdres, this is Corporal Osei. We have your position. Good call on 7 Alpha, by the way, gives you clean sight lines on the north corridor. Veth looked at the comms panel. His gill slits had gone amber again. Corporal, he said. This is Analyst Vethkaras. We are tracking the situation in the northern formation. Can you confirm that he paused, because the technical language he had available for what he wanted to ask was anomalous structural collapse of a Krethnali siege cordon, which was accurate but presupposed an explanation he didn't have. What is your current status? A brief pause. A sound in the background he couldn't classify. Then, stations mostly holding. Lost the outer ring, obviously. But, the interior sections are intact and, we've got about 6 redundant defensive positions still operational. You have 6 operational positions, Veth repeated. Give or take. Sarge estimated 7 originally, but we had to use one of them as bait, so. Veth noted the word bait. He tagged it for later. You are 12 personnel, he said. Against a full Krethnali siege formation. Yeah. The background noise shifted, something different now, something that his audio processors were having difficulty categorizing, a complex of sounds that included what was definitely a human voice in the middle distance saying something fast and, apparently instructional, and several other sounds he could not place at all. Yeah, that's the situation. Corporal. Veth chose his next words with the care he typically reserved for diplomatic communications with species whose primary threat response was involuntary and fatal. What are you doing to their northern formation? The pause this time was different. Less tactical, more considering. You want the long version or the short version? I would prefer, Veth said, the version that explains what I am seeing. The long version took 11 minutes, and Veth added it to the log in real time, because it was the kind of information that needed to be in the log before anything else happened, on the grounds that he was not entirely confident he would retain all of it in accurate form if he had to reconstruct it from memory later. Osei had a voice like someone who had been awake for a long time and had stopped registering it as a problem. He spoke with the slightly disjointed efficiency of someone delivering a tactical briefing that they had not had time to write down and were therefore reconstructing as they went, skipping occasionally over details he apparently thought were obvious and, then, pausing to add them back in when he remembered he was talking to an outside party. The situation, as Veth understood it, 12 coalition liaison personnel human, all of them, a fact Osei mentioned only incidentally and, with no particular emphasis, had been present on Veteran Station when the Crethnali siege cordon established itself 6 hours ago. The station's permanent garrison, Sorelian and Pelani mixed, approximately 200 personnel, had followed standard defensive protocols, which meant organized retreat to hardened interior sections, which meant abandoning the outer ring, which meant the Crethnali's first phase neutralization of the outer ring had met no resistance and proceeded on schedule. The 12 liaison personnel had not followed standard defensive protocols. This was, Osei explained, because Sergeant Adeyemi had assessed the standard defensive protocols and determined that they were, he quoted her, with a specific quality in his voice that Veth added to the log as quotation, apparent reverence, context, professional respect, designed by people who'd never had a siege formation at their 12 o'clock and thought siege formations had rules. So instead of retreating to the interior sections, the 12 had split. 2 had gone to the station's engineering core with instructions to selectively disable specific sensor systems. 3 had deployed to the outer ring with equipment Osei described as whatever we had, and orders to make the outer ring structural neutralization take 3 times as long as projected. 4 had positioned themselves in the maintenance infrastructure running under the outer ring's deck plating with a communication system Adeyemi had apparently assembled from 2 broken tactical transceivers and a piece of station equipment whose original purpose Osei described as something to do with waste processing and a function he described as it works, I don't question it. The remaining 3, including Adeyemi herself and the one Veth knew only as Reeves, had gone somewhere Osei referred to only as the good spot, and had not explained further. What this arrangement had produced, over 6 hours, was as follows. The sensor disabling in the engineering core had fed the Crethnali formation false positional data about the station's defensive capabilities. Specifically, it had made the station's interior appear to contain significantly more hardened positions than actually existed, spread across a larger area than the actual floor plan, with a weapons loadout that did not correspond to what the station actually possessed. The Crethnali, receiving this data and applying their standard analytical models, had concluded that the station was a significantly harder target than their initial assessment had indicated. They had adjusted their siege approach accordingly. They had slowed down. Veth ran the numbers on this while Osei was still talking. 41 standard Crethnali tactical analyses of initial resistance data, all of which he had in the archives. Every single one showed the same response pattern. When initial data suggested stronger than expected resistance, the formation tightened before proceeding, adding pressure on the flanks to compensate for the slower central advance. The northern arc was the left flank of the Crethnali formation relative to the station's main axis. It had tightened. The 4 personnel in the maintenance infrastructure had been waiting for it to tighten. Because when the northern arc tightened, 2 of the cordon vessels moved to a specific grid position, a position that had appeared, on all pre-siege scans of the engagement zone, to be an unremarkable section of debris from a previous engagement. Unremarkable except to someone who had, apparently, spent the 3 hours before the siege began repositioning specific pieces of that debris with station-based maneuvering thrusters in a pattern that created a very particular kind of corridor. The kind of corridor that funneled incoming vessels into a specific zone. The kind of zone that, if you then activated a localized electromagnetic pulse from 4 positions in the maintenance infrastructure simultaneously, would catch both vessels in the overlapping field at maximum effect. The Crethnali did not use EMP as a tactical tool. They had hardened their systems against conventional electromagnetic attacks centuries ago. The hardening was thorough and well documented. The hardening worked against attacks on a known vector. The attacks had come from 4 directions simultaneously, through the station's own structural framework, using the station's own power conduits as transmission medium. The hardening had not worked. 2 Crethnali cordon vessels had lost maneuvering capability simultaneously. Osei described the resulting gap in the cordon as significant and then paused and said, actually, Sarge would probably call it workable. The remaining gap in the northern arc, the gap currently visible on the Valdris's sensors as a section of formerly invulnerable siege geometry that was now behaving like something with structural damage, was not the end of the sequence. It was the beginning of it. The rest of it is still in progress, Osei said, and Veth could hear something in the background that was now definitively weapons fire, close and rhythmic, and something else that sounded like a human voice counting down from a number he couldn't quite catch. Corporal, Veth said. What is the rest of it? Osei's background went briefly louder. The counting voice, now audible, said 3, 2 and then, there was an impact sound. Veth's sensor array registered as a physical shockwave, originating from the station's northern exterior. That, said Osei, is the rest of it. Veth pulled up the external sensor feed and watched the northern arc's second collapse. He did not have adequate language for this. He sat with that fact as an honest assessment, turned it over in his mind the way he turned over unexplained data, and found it was accurate in a way that unsettled him more than the tactical situation. He had a vocabulary of approximately 4,000 technical terms for military engagements, drawn from 14 years of professional analysis, drawn from a species that had been conducting and documenting warfare for 800 cycles. He had studied 47 Creth-Nayli conflicts in detail. None of his vocabulary covered what he was watching. The shockwave had originated from a controlled detonation in the maintenance conduit system of the station's northern exterior, a system that, on any standard schematic, was non-military infrastructure with no combat application. The detonation had not targeted the Creth-Nayli vessels directly. It had targeted the debris field that the vessels had repositioned themselves near when the cordon tightened, specifically, a section of debris that was, Veth now recognized, moving. Not randomly. The debris had been modified. When he ran the spectral analysis, this took him 40 seconds, and he was aware, in a distant and irrelevant way, that 40 seconds was not fast. He could see the thruster signatures. Small ones. Attached to 3 of the largest debris sections with what appeared to be, and this was the part where his clinical language began to fracture slightly at the edges, the emergency sealant foam from the station's repair supplies. The debris sections had been turned into improvised kinetic projectiles. The detonation in the maintenance conduit had been the trigger mechanism. The 2 Creth-Nayli vessels that had survived the EMP and were attempting to re-establish formation had moved, as Veth's own analysis now told him they inevitably would, into the corridor between the debris and the station when the northern arc tightened. The corridor that had been prepared. The corridor that existed only because someone had spent 3 hours using station maneuvering thrusters to reposition debris with the specific geometry needed to create it. Before the siege started. Before anyone could possibly have known the Creth-Nayli would respond to the false sensor data by tightening the flank. Unless someone had looked at 47 Creth-Nayli tactical analyses or had not looked at them at all, had simply inferred the pattern from first principles, from the premise that a methodical enemy with a consistent approach will respond consistently, and built the trap before the trap was needed. Veth's skill slits went a color he had never seen them go before. He did not have a clinical name for it. He added it to the log as stress indicator, severity, unclassified, character, not distress. He sat very still for a moment. Then, he went to find Adeyemi. She was in the corridor outside the comms bay when he came out. She had apparently been waiting. She had a container of something in her hand. He identified it as a ration pack from the Valdris's emergency stores, flavor designation, nutrient-dense, palatability rating, low, and she was eating it with the expression of someone fueling a machine rather than enjoying a meal, steady and efficient and, with approximately the level of engagement she gave to a maintenance task that was necessary but not interesting. She looked at him. She stopped eating. "You talked to Osei," she said. "Yes." A pause. She resumed eating. "And?" "You planned the debris configuration before the siege began," Veth said. "Before you could know how they would position." "I knew how they would position." She shrugged. The gesture was compact, a rolling motion of one shoulder, and Veth noted it because it was not a dismissive gesture, it was more the gesture of someone explaining a step in a process that seemed obvious in retrospect. They always tighten the flank when resistance data reads higher than expected. Always. 47 engagements, every single time. You reviewed the Sorelian tactical archives. Station had them. I had 3 hours. She finished the ration pack and folded the container into a precise square, which she then tucked into her equipment harness rather than discarding, a detail Veth noted with the disproportionate focus that had become, over the last several hours, his primary coping mechanism for things he was not yet ready to process directly. The debris field took about 2 hours of maneuvering. The maintenance conduit prep took another hour. We were ready before the cordon closed. Veth looked at her. He became aware that he was looking at her with a specific quality of attention that his species reserved for encountering data that required a complete reordering of prior assumptions. "You prepared a multi-stage trap for a Krethnali siege formation," he said, "in 3 hours, using station infrastructure and debris before the siege began, based on your own projection of how they would respond to sensor data that your own personnel had not yet falsified." "Yeah. And the 12 of you." 11, technically. "Kowalski's running the engineering core solo because she's better at it alone and she told us to stop helping." 11 personnel are holding a station against a Krethnali siege formation, which has never lost a siege. She looked at him. "It's losing this one," she said. Not with pride. With the flat, certain quality of the weather forecast. "It's raining. It's going to rain. It's been raining for hours and the forecast said so." Veth's gill slits did that thing again. The color he didn't have a name for. He asked her, because he could not ask, how she had known to position the Valdris at 7 Alpha. They were in the observation alcove off the main corridor. She had asked if there was somewhere with a viewport, because she wanted to see the engagement zone directly rather than through sensor feeds, a preference Veth had initially flagged as tactically suboptimal before realizing that she was using the viewport to run visual tracking on the Krethnali formation movements in a way that complemented rather than duplicated his sensor data. She tracked the engagement zone. He watched her track it. He noted the pattern of her eye movements, which were not random. They cycled between specific points in the debris field and the formation in a sequence that, the longer he watched, began to resolve itself as a systematic scan. Not frantic. Not searching. Like someone reading a map they had largely memorized. 7 Alpha gives you line of sight on the northern corridor without putting you in the priority engagement arc, she said, without looking away from the viewport. The Krethnali target based on a threat value algorithm. You're a midline data vessel, disabled. Your threat value to them is low. They'll ignore you as long as you don't do anything they read as a threat action. How do you know their threat value algorithm? It's in the archives. The Sorelian archives don't document Krethnali combat engagement algorithms. No. A pause. Still watching the viewport. But 47 engagements give you a sample size. You can reverse engineer the algorithm from observed behavior. Veth considered this. In his 14 years of tactical analysis, he had reviewed each of those 47 engagements. He had not reverse engineered the threat value algorithm. It had not occurred to him to reverse engineer it from behavioral data because the information had not been available in direct form, and he categorized unavailable information as a data gap rather than a derivation opportunity. He was going to add this to the log. He was going to add a very specific note to the log. "Sergeant," he said. "What is your training background?" She glanced at him then. The first real glance, the kind that meant she was actually attending to him rather than to the engagement zone. "Combat engineering," she said. 3 years. Before that, construction. Before that, a brief pause, something in her expression that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it. "Before that I was 16 and I lived in Lagos and I fixed things for money because things were always breaking." Lagos, Veth said. City on Earth. She went back to the viewport. Dig 1. Active seismic zone. The buildings fall down sometimes and you fix them and they fall down again and you fix them again. A pause. Good training for this. Veth noted this. He noted it and then he sat with it and then he added a second notation directly after it, because one notation was not adequate. The human's tactical methodology appears to be observe, infer, prepare, adapt. In that order, with no step skipped. This sequence is standard in analytical operations. What is not standard is the time frame. 3 hours to observe a debris field, infer a specific enemy response to data that had not yet been falsified, and construct a trap that required the enemy to respond exactly as inferred. This is not unusual competence. This is a different classification of process, and I do not yet have the right classification. Secondary notation, she said things fall down and you fix them. She said this as an explanation of tactical training. As if these are the same category of problem. I am beginning to think she believes they are. The second Crethnaley communication came 40 minutes after the Northern Ark's second collapse. It was addressed to the station, again. But, the frequency was different, not the broad coalition-accessible broadcast they'd used for the surrender demand. A narrower transmission. More specific. Veth ran the frequency analysis and tagged it as targeting communication, intent, direct engagement, unusual, addressee is besieged party. The Crethnaley siege commander's voice, Van Ras, the undefeated record, the unblemished archive entry, said, in the formal address mode that the Sorelian translation matrix rendered as carrying weight of serious official communication, you are outnumbered. Your outer ring is neutralized. You have no resupply and no reinforcement within operational range. The rational course is clear. The response from the station came 14 seconds later. The same voice as before Reeves, Adeyemi had said, and the voice was lower and slightly rougher and had an accent that the translation matrix flagged as regional variant, Earth, North Atlantic coastal, which Veth added to his log for no reason he could immediately identify. I heard you the first time, said Reeves. A pause from the Crethnaley frequency. Then, you are 12 personnel against a siege formation of 47 vessels. 43, said Reeves. You're down 4. A longer pause. Veth watched the engagement zone. The Northern Ark had not re-established. The Crethnaley vessels were repositioning, not in the standard tightening pattern, not in the withdrawal pattern, in something else, something that his tactical models were rendering as formation adjustment, intent, unclear, anomaly, inconsistent with standard doctrine. They were confused. The thought arrived in Veth's analytical process and settled there with a kind of weight he hadn't expected. The Crethnaley, whose siege formations had held for 300 cycles. Whose tactical doctrine was, in his professional assessment, among the most precisely calibrated in the known coalition space. They were confused. Not by firepower. Not by a superior force. By 11:12, with Adeyemi aboard the Valdres, humans who had spent 3 hours rewriting the terrain before the battle started and were now delivering tactical results that the siege commander's own models apparently hadn't projected. Why are they not adapting faster, Veth said. He was asking himself, mostly. Habit. But, Adeyemi answered. Because their models assumed the resistance they're facing is station-based, she said. Fixed position, known infrastructure, predictable resource limitations. They're trying to calculate how a station with fake sensor readings and a debris trap is going to respond next. She was still watching the viewport. But, that's not what they're facing. Veth looked at her. What are they facing, he said. She was quiet for a moment. People who grew up on a planet where the soil liquefies under your feet sometimes, she said, and you learn that the ground is not something you stand on, it's something you use. Veth did not have a response to this. He added it to the log. He thought about Sevrath, the Sorelian word for irrational persistence, the word he'd been trying to apply to what he was watching, the word that kept failing to fit. He turned it over. He set it aside. He thought about the word he didn't have yet. The Crethnaley did not withdraw. He hadn't expected them to. 300 cycles of unblemished record meant the siege commander had no framework for withdrawal. Withdrawal was not a step in a process that had never required it. What they did instead, over the next 2 hours, was regroup and reassess and apply more force to the southern and eastern arcs, concentrating their pressure where the station's known defensive positions were strongest. Standard doctrine. By the numbers. Adeyemi watched them do this from the viewport with an expression Veth could not classify and had stopped trying to classify, and then said, "Time to talk to Ose," and went to the comms bay. He followed. He told himself it was documentation. The conversation she had with Ose was short, 4 minutes, most of it consisting of a series of terse exchanges that the translation matrix rendered as tactical instructions, detail, high, context, insufficient for full external analysis. Veth caught fragments, coordinates that he could map, timing windows he could calculate, references to pieces of station infrastructure whose significance he was only partially equipped to understand. What he could understand, she was not responding to the Krethnali's repositioning with a defensive adjustment. She was responding to it as if their repositioning was itself a step in a sequence she had anticipated. When she finished, he asked her, "You expected them to concentrate on the south and east arcs?" "Yes." "Because?" "Because that's the rational response to losing the north." She glanced at him. "When you lose a flank, you reinforce the center and the opposite flank. That's what the doctrine says. That's what they did. And you prepared for this." 2 days ago, she said. "Before I left the station." Veth processed this. 2 days ago. Before the siege. Before the sensor falsification, before the debris repositioning, before 11 personnel decided that the standard defensive protocols designed by people who had never had a siege formation at their 12 o'clock were not adequate. 2 days ago, Adeyemi had apparently looked at the engagement zone and the station infrastructure and the 47 Krethnali engagements in the archive and had extended the sequence out further than he had. He had run the numbers on the debris repositioning and been staggered by the audacity and the execution. She had already moved past that. She had already accounted for its success and planned the next step. "What did you prepare?" he said. "For the south and east arcs?" She shrugged again, that same compact roll of one shoulder. "That one's Reeves's job. I just made sure he had the materials." Veth noted the tone. "That one's Reeves's job." As if they were running shifts. As if they had divided the siege, a Krethnali siege, 300 cycles undefeated, into tasks and assigned them and were working through the list. He looked at the comms panel, and then at the viewport, and then at the tactical display showing 43 Krethnali vessels concentrating on the station's southern approach with the methodical, terrible efficiency that had broken everything they had ever faced. He thought about the word he didn't have. He was getting closer to it. 3 hours before the Krethnali formation broke, Vethkaris made an entry in his mission log that he would later delete, and then restore, and then delete again, and then restore a final time and leave there because some things need to be in the record even if they don't belong in a professional document. The entry read, "I have been trying for approximately 7 hours to classify what I am observing. My training provides me with categories: tactical genius, unusual competence, superior preparation, strategic deception. These categories are all applicable and none of them are adequate. They describe individual operations. They do not describe the quality I keep encountering, the one that predates and underlies all the operations, the one that was present before the siege started and will presumably still be present if the siege ends. I keep looking for the right Sorelian term. Sevrath irrational persistence is wrong because this is not irrational. Velkan, the efficiency of a well-calibrated system, is wrong because this is not systematic, not in the way we use that word. The closest I can find is resthal, which is the term for a material that deforms under pressure but does not break, and recovers its original form when the pressure lifts. We use it in structural engineering, mostly. I am not certain it maps correctly to a person. I am beginning to think the problem is not that I don't have the right word. The problem is that the right word would have to come from somewhere it has not been before. End entry. Reeves's voice on the comms had a quality Veth found increasingly difficult to characterize over the 6 hours he'd been intercepting it. It was dry, not the performed dryness of someone deploying understatement as a tactic, but the bedrock dryness of someone who had processed whatever they were doing well enough that the urgency had settled into something functional. Like a ship that had been running at emergency speed long enough that the emergency speed was just speed now. The station's southern and eastern approaches had been taking concentrated Krethnali fire for 2 hours. Reeves had apparently been in those approaches. "Station holding," he reported, on the third check-in, and Veth could hear behind him the specific acoustic signature of a compartment taking impacts, not breaching, but taking them, the structural percussion of a position under sustained pressure. "We've burned through the secondary foam reserves on the eastern corridor. Kowalski's synthesizing more." "She can do that," Veth said. Meaning, the synthesis process for emergency sealant foam required equipment he was not aware of the station possessing. "She says she can do it," Reeves said. "I've learned not to ask follow-up questions. That is, Veth said, a consistent approach among your personnel. A sound from Reeves's end that the translation matrix identified as vocalization, brief, apparent humor, context, appropriate to conversation. Laughter. He was laughing. Under sustained concentrated fire from 43 vessels. Veth noted this. He noted it and, then, he sat with the fact that he had noted it, which was itself something to note, because his clinical logging process was not designed for this, for the continuous redirection of analytical resources toward data points that were not tactically significant and were not stopping being significant regardless. Adeyemi was in the secondary observation bay. He had left her there 20 minutes ago after a conversation about the station's remaining defensive timeline that had covered the material efficiently and, then, arrived at a point where there was nothing left to cover, where the tactical situation was suspended in its pre-resolution phase, where all there was to do was wait, and they had both found that the observation bay with its working viewport was a better place to wait than the comms terminal. He went back. She was standing at the viewport. She had her arms crossed, a posture he had seen twice now, and which appeared, based on cross-referenced behavioral data from the 6 other human personnel he had encountered in his career, to indicate a state of focused internal processing rather than threat posture. She was watching the engagement zone. Her equipment harness was fully reloaded. At some point in the last hour she had apparently sourced additional materials from the Valvras's supplies and restocked it, a process he had not observed and had found the results of when she returned from whatever she'd been doing. He did not ask. He was learning not to ask. Or rather, he was learning to ask specifically and directly about things that required asking, and to let the other things, the parallel processes, the preparation that predated the crisis, the restocking that happened invisibly, be what they were. He stood at the viewport next to her. The engagement zone was wrong. That was the most precise description his magnetic perception could produce. The engagement zone was wrong in the way that data is wrong when it does not match the model, when the values are where the variables should be and the variables are where the values should be, when the organized geometry of a siege formation that had held its shape for 47 engagements had developed, over the course of 11 hours, a quality of disorder that his analytical process kept trying to read as error. Data. It was not error data. It was what 43 vessels looked like when they had been in contact with an opponent they could not model. The Krethnali had been adapting. They were not incompetent. They were reacting to each development, the sensor falsification, the EMP strike, the debris projectiles, with their standard countermeasure protocol, tightening the appropriate arc, applying compensating pressure to adjacent sections, maintaining their methodical advance. Each reaction was tactically correct. Each reaction was also exactly what the station had prepared for. Veth had been tracking this pattern for the last 2 hours. He had stopped being surprised by it approximately 90 minutes ago and had moved into a state he had no category for, something past surprise, something that was almost familiar except that the familiarity was not his own. He was starting to think like someone who had read the sequence before it happened and was now watching it confirm itself. He was, he realized, thinking about the situation the way Adeyemi would think about it. He noted this. He noted it with the specific clinical precision he used when the thing he was noting was significant enough that he needed the clinical precision to keep his distance from it. The Eastern Corridor, he said. Holding. Reeves mentioned the secondary foam reserves are depleted. He would have identified substitutes. She did not look away from the viewport. There are 3 materials in a standard station's construction supply that have similar bonding properties under pressure. He knows that. Does he know that because he reviewed the material specification documents? He knows it because I told him, she said. 2 days ago. 2 days ago. Veth looked at the scuff on her boot. He had been looking at it at intervals all day, at moments when the data flow required a direction and the data itself was not processing cleanly. The scuff was at a specific angle to the toe, consistent with a repeated motion, kneeling, he thought, something that involved significant time in a crouched position over a surface at a slight incline. The leather had been abraded unevenly, more at the outer edge than the inner, which meant the pressure had been coming from the right side, which meant the surface had been sloped. He was reasonably certain he knew what she had been doing 2 days ago on that slope. You surveyed the station's maintenance infrastructure before the siege, he said. I survey every station's infrastructure. A slight pause. Habit. Because? She looked at the viewport. The engagement zone. The ships out there whose commander had never lost and who was losing. Because infrastructure is the terrain, she said. And terrain is the battle. The weapons are just how you use the terrain. Veth sat with this. He added it to the log. Then, he added, she said terrain is the battle. She said it as a general principle, not as a tactical decision. As if this is a prior, not a conclusion. As if this is what you learn when the ground liquefies under your feet and you have to use it anyway. The battle for the Eastern Corridor was what Veth would, much later, be asked to describe more often than anything else from the engagement log. He could not describe it directly, because he was not in the Eastern Corridor. He was on the Valdres, watching the sensor feeds and the comms traffic and Adeyemi's face in his peripheral magnetic perception as she tracked developments he was sometimes 90 seconds behind on. What he could describe was the pattern of the incoming comms traffic. From OSE, short, precise, coordinates and timing windows, nothing wasted. From Kowalski, even shorter, mostly technical designations, and once a sequence of numbers that Veth could not interpret and that Adeyemi received with a nod and a brief good that she did not explain. From the two personnel whose names he had not yet learned, fragments, tactical fragments, the kind of shorthand that existed between people who had communicated under fire long enough to have removed all unnecessary language. From Reeves, intervals. Timed. Deliberately paced. Reporting position, status, threat level, and, in between the tactical reporting, twice, something that was not tactical at all. The first time, a specific brief sound that the translation matrix tagged as vocal, apparent humor, context, unclear. The second time, 40 minutes later, in the middle of what Veth's sensors were showing as concentrated Krethnali fire on the Eastern Corridor's outer junction, a handful of words that the translation matrix processed and, then, flagged with a notation Veth had never seen it produce before. Idiomatic expression, translation confidence, low, apparent function, cohesion signal. What Reeves had said, to no one specifically and, apparently to all of them simultaneously, this is a good fight. Veth looked at the sensor feed showing the Eastern Corridor taking impacts at a rate that his structural analysis was projecting as critical within 40 minutes. This is a good fight. He added it to the log. He did not trust himself to annotate it. 40 minutes later, the Eastern Corridor did not fall. The Krethnali pushed hard. The tactical pressure on that section was the highest Veth had seen in the engagement, not the highest in the records he had studied, but, for a 12-person defense of a station that should have surrendered 6 hours ago, the numbers were extraordinary, and the response to those numbers was he watched it on the sensor feeds. They gave ground. Not in collapse, in a specific, measured withdrawal that pulled the Krethnali advance through the outer junction and into the connector corridor and, then, when they were exactly where the withdrawal had been drawing them, held. From 3 positions simultaneously, using the connector corridor's own structural members as barricades. Using the fact that the corridor was narrower there by exactly the right margin, exactly the margin that Adeyemi had told him, 3 hours ago in a completely different conversation, was the critical variable in corridor defense, the point at which a numerical advantage became a disadvantage because the numbers could not all fit in the space. She had not said it as a prediction. She had said it as a principle. Veth checked the corridor dimensions on the station schematic. The connector corridor was the measurement she had named. Exactly. He looked at her. She was watching the feed. Not the connector corridor specifically, she was watching the formation-wide sensor display, tracking the Krethnali's response to the Eastern check, watching the way the formation adjusted and, where it pulled pressure from and, what that left exposed. There, she said, quietly. He pulled up the display she was looking at. The Western Arc. The Krethnali had moved resources to support the Eastern push. The Western Arc, which had been maintained at standard pressure throughout the engagement, had thinned, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to a standard tactical analysis without context. Visible only if you knew the formation's baseline geometry and could measure the deviation. Visible, Veth recognized, if you had been tracking that formation for the last 11 hours. How long has the western arc been thin? He said. About 20 minutes. She had already moved to the comms. Oh, say. The response was immediate. Ready. It's time, she said. A pause, the same length as all of Osei's pauses before he relayed information out, the pause that indicated active transmission to other personnel rather than processing time. Copy, he said. Reeves is going to be annoyed we didn't wait for him. Tell him he can complain about it later. The edge of something in her voice, not quite humor, the specific quality adjacent to it, the thing that only appeared when she was tracking multiple contingencies simultaneously and found that they were converging. Is the secondary junction clear? As of 3 minutes ago. Then, go. Veth did not fully understand what he was watching for the next 22 minutes. He had the sensor feeds. He had the comms traffic. He had Adeyemi next to him, who was watching the displays with the focused, comprehensive attention of someone who had built the sequence and was now running quality control, noting deviations, adjusting instructions in real time through a series of brief exchanges with Osei that were dense with information he could only partially parse. What he could see on the sensors, the western arc of the Krethnali formation, already thinned by the resource draw to the east, was hit from a direction that his formation tracking had not anticipated. Not from the station's western defensive positions, those remained exactly where they had been, doing exactly what they had been doing. From the maintenance infrastructure. From the conduit system running under the station's outer plating, the same system that had delivered the EMP strike to the northern arc, except this time the strike was not electromagnetic. This time it was, and the sensor reading took him 3 analyses to trust, thermal. A localized, precise thermal discharge through the station's own heating infrastructure, directed through specific conduit junctions at specific Krethnali vessel positions, using the thermal conductivity of the debris field as a medium. The debris field that had been modified 2 days ago. Before the siege. The thermal vulnerability in Krethnali hull materials at that specific frequency was in the Sorelian tactical archives. Veth knew it was there because he had filed it, 18 months ago, in the category Theoretical Vulnerabilities, Application, No Current Delivery Method. The category had been wrong. He looked at Adeyemi. She was watching the western arc dissolve, not in explosion, not in dramatic collapse, in the specific, legible way that a formation falls apart when 2 of its anchor vessels lose maneuvering capability simultaneously and the vessels around them have to choose between maintaining formation and avoiding collision. The vessels chose to avoid collision. The formation opened. The station's western defensive positions, which had been maintaining steady but non-aggressive pressure all engagement, read the opening and pushed. The push found the gap. And the Krethnali formation, 43 vessels, 300 cycles unblemished, the record that had held across 6 coalition conflicts and 47 engagements, fractured. Not broke. Fractured. Veth noted the distinction because it was important. This was not a rout, not a defeat in the archival sense. This was a formation that had encountered a problem it could not solve with its existing methodology and was recognizing that fact at the command level. The vessels were not fleeing. They were repositioning. But the repositioning was reactive rather than doctrinal. The geometry was wrong. The siege commander, Van Rass, the unblemished record, was making tactical decisions that were not wrong exactly, but were not right in the way that his decisions had always been right before. He was improvising. He had been forced to improvise. By 11 people in a station. Veth said nothing for a long time. The sensor feeds updated. The formation repositioned, regrouped, and this was the data point that Veth logged first and returned to repeatedly over the next several minutes, withdrew. Not from the engagement entirely. From the inner cordon positions. The Krethnali siege formation contracted to a holding distance, maintaining the blockade but relinquishing the aggressive advance. Tactical assessment: the siege was not over. The blockade was intact. They were not defeated. But they had stopped advancing. For the first time in 300 cycles. 11 humans had made a Krethnali formation stop. Veth added this to the log. He was very precise about the wording. He wrote it 3 times until the phrasing was accurate and not more or less than accurate. Then, he looked at Adeyemi. She was looking at the sensor feeds. Not with the weather forecast expression of a confirmed prediction, with something else, something quieter, something that had moved past the operational and into the human territory that his analytical categories did not map. She was looking at the feeds the way you look at something when the doing of it is finished and what remains is the fact of it. The reinforcements will arrive in 4 hours, Veth said. At that point, the blockade becomes untenable. Yes. The station's defensive infrastructure is significantly degraded. I am projecting that with reinforcement and your current personnel, full defensive capability can be restored within Veth, she said. He stopped. She turned and looked at him directly, for the first time in several hours, not the evaluation look, not the tactical assessment glance, but directly, with the specific quality of attention that indicated she was seeing him rather than the situation around him. 4 hours is fine, she said. We're fine. He looked at the sensor feeds. He looked at the tactical display showing a Krethnali formation in a posture his archives had no precedent for. He looked at the engagement log he had been building all day, which was now the most extensively annotated document in his professional career by a factor of approximately 7. He looked at the scuff on her boot. Yes, he said, finally. You are. The reinforcements arrived in 3 hours and 40 minutes. They brought a full tactical squadron, 2 medical vessels, a logistics platform, and this was the detail that Veth noted in his log with what he recognized, in retrospect, as his first unguarded observation of the entire engagement. They looked stunned. He watched the lead tactical commander's transmission to Vethran Station on the comms feed. Watched the commander, a Sorelian admiral whose career review he was familiar with, a thorough analyst, difficult to surprise, receive the operational summary from Osei. Watched the command-level blankness that crossed the admiral's features when she reached the point in the summary describing the siege formation's current status. 43 vessels, she said. Standard Krethnali cordon. And you held them, said Osei. Yes, sir. With 12 personnel. 11. Sergeant Adeyemi was aboard a coalition vessel for part of it. The admiral looked at her own tactical display, presumably showing the same data Veth had been watching for the last 12 hours. Her gill slits, gray-green, same resting tone as Veth's own, had gone a color that Veth recognized because he had been there. How, the admiral said. There was a pause on the station end. Then, Reeves's voice, unhurried, the bedrock dryness fully intact, the terrain was good. The Valdres was taken under tow 2 hours after the reinforcements arrived. Veth spent those 2 hours in the comms bay completing the initial mission log documentation and beginning the preliminary contact report that command would require, because there had been 11 to 12, with Adeyemi, confirmed human personnel in this engagement, and that was the first confirmed multi-individual human contact in 40 cycles, and the paperwork implications were, he could already see, going to be significant. Adeyemi spent those 2 hours helping the Valdres's engineering team address 3 hull fractures that she had identified as progressing beyond the initial stabilization, using material she had apparently located in the ship's storage sections, completing the work with 2 crew members who had started the shift following her with the specific quality of attention that Veth recognized as people learning something they had not been taught. She left when the tow locked on. A brief exchange at the airlock, she was transferring back to the station for the debrief. He was staying with the Valdres for the transit. She looked at him at the airlock. That direct look. You annotate everything, she said. Yes. Good. She sealed her helmet. Make sure you get it right. He got it right. He tried. The preliminary contact report was filed on schedule. The formal documentation went through 3 review cycles. The tactical analysis of the Vethran Station engagement was, as he had projected, the most consequential thing he wrote in his career, not because of his analysis, but because of the event itself, which was now in the record and which the record was going to have to catch up to. There was one thing he added to the personal log that did not go into the formal documentation. The word. He had been looking for it all day. The word that covered what Adeyemi and her 11 personnel had done, the word that was not Sevrath and was not Velkan and was not Resthal and was not any of the 4,000 technical terms he had available. He had not found it in Sorelian. He found it, eventually, in the Human Language Archives, buried in a linguistics database that he accessed because he was trying to understand the word terrain as Adeyemi had used it, whether it was a precise technical term or a broader one. He went looking for the exact meaning and found something else next to it, a word from an older stratum of the language, a word that the etymological note described as rarely used in its original form. Resourceful. He read the full definition. Then, the etymology. Then, 3 usage examples from the historical record. Then, he sat with it for a long time. The Sorelian language had 17 words for different kinds of intelligence. It had 12 words for different kinds of strength. It had 8 words for different kinds of strategy and 6 for different kinds of courage. It had no word for this. Resourceful, the quality of being able to find, use, or make tools, solutions, or paths from whatever is available. Not because of prior preparation, not because of superior capability, but because the assumption that something can be done is so foundational that the absence of obvious means does not register as an obstacle. The assumption that the gap between what you have and what you need is a problem to solve, not a problem to accept. He thought about the 3 hours before a siege. The debris repositioning. The maintenance conduit. The thermal vulnerability in the tactical archives under no current delivery method. He thought about things fall down and you fix them. He wrote in the log, "I have found the word I was looking for. It is not Sorelian. This is probably relevant. There is a quality in the humans I observe today that I am going to call resourceful because that is the closest available term and because I suspect that any species that has to invent this concept as a separate category rather than having it as a prior has already made the mistake that costs them. The Krethnali did not model this. I do not think the Krethnali have a word for it either. I did not model it. I had all the data. 47 engagements. 14 years. I wrote the likely myth assessment myself. I have amended that assessment. The amendment is on file. I am also, and I am noting this here because it belongs somewhere, going to stop writing likely in front of things I haven't confirmed. Adeyemi described the station's situation as fine 11 hours ago. It was fine. I spent 11 hours documenting reasons it might not be. She didn't. There is something in that gap. I am still working out what to do with it. End log. He closed the document. The Vulvrus hummed around him, familiar and repaired, the hull stress readings steady at acceptable values. Through the viewport, the engagement zone was quiet. The Krethnali formation had withdrawn to a holding distance that the reinforcement squadron was already beginning to address, and the tactical situation was resolved in the operational sense, the sense his 14 years had trained him to recognize. He opened the log again. Added 1 line. She said, "Make sure you get it right." I am not certain I have. But I think it is as right as I know how to make it, which is the best I can offer, and I think I have been thinking about this for the last 3 hours, that she would consider that acceptable. Not adequate. Acceptable. There is a difference. I am learning the difference. End log. Final. He did not close it for another hour.